The kettle whistled in the quiet of Margaret Holloway's cottage, nestled deep in the Devon countryside. She moved slowly these days. Age had crept upon her like ivy up a stone wall, subtle, unrelenting. Yet her mind was still sharp, and every sound, every silence, she noticed. On the mantel, among the dust and faint cobwebs, stood a row of Christmas cards. One from the neighbours. Another from the postmistress. And one from her cousin Marjorie in Cornwall, who sent a card every year despite being half blind. But not from him. Not for 26 years. Margaret stood by the window, staring at the narrow road beyond the garden gate. It twisted like a ribbon through fields that had known her youth, her marriage, her motherhood. But today, that ribbon delivered something unexpected. The postman, Rupert, tipped his cap and passed her a brown envelope. "Registered," he said. "Looks important." She thanked him politely and returned inside. Her fingers trembled as she slit the envelope open with the brass letter opener that once belonged to her late husband, Douglas. Inside, a letter. Her breath caught. From Edward Holloway. Her son. Margaret sat down slowly, her knees creaking. She unfolded the letter, the paper smooth and heavy in her hands, the ink smudged in one corner. It wasn't a long message. In fact, it was shockingly brief. "Mum, I hope this finds you well. I know it's been a long time. We'd like to invite you to Christmas this year. I'll send the address if you write back. Edward." She read it thrice before setting it down on her lap. Outside, the wind howled faintly, brushing dry leaves along the garden path. She hadn't seen him since the argument. Since he'd stood on her doorstep with packed bags and eyes full of fire. "I'm not your little boy anymore," he'd said, voice cracking. "You're still my son," she'd whispered back. But he'd left. Now, a sentence. A holiday. A door reopened after nearly 3 decades of silence. Margaret didn't know whether to laugh or weep. She simply sat, the ticking of the clock her only company, wondering what it meant that he reached out now, after all this time. Then her gaze shifted. Beside the envelope lay another, unopened. The solicitor's mark in the corner gave it away. She had only opened it the day before. An inheritance. From an uncle in Scotland she'd barely known. A fortune, they said. An amount so large she had to read it aloud to believe it. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Margaret waited 3 days before replying. She wrote carefully, every word measured, every line rewritten once, sometimes twice. She avoided anything too emotional. No mention of the silence, the ache, or the birthdays missed. Just a simple acknowledgement, a faint echo of warmth. She enclosed her address and posted it with trembling hands. The days that followed felt strangely unfamiliar, as if something in the atmosphere had shifted. The cottage, once a haven of stillness, now felt like it held its breath. She imagined his home in Surrey. Was it grand? Did he marry well? Did he have children? Were they told she was dead, or worse, didn't care? Then, on a Thursday morning, it arrived. A silver envelope, far too fancy for mere directions. Inside, a formal invitation embossed in gold ink. Edward and Lydia Holloway cordially invite you to spend Christmas at Rosebourne Hall, Surrey. So he had married Lydia. The name meant nothing to her, though she'd imagined the face 1,000 times, sometimes cold, sometimes warm, always faceless. She traced the cursive letters with her finger, eyes catching on the final line. Accommodation will be provided. Kindly confirm your attendance by the 10th. Not a word more. No, hope to see you. No, we've missed you. Not even his handwriting. Perhaps Lydia had written it. Still, she packed a modest bag and booked her train. She hadn't been to Surrey since Edward was a schoolboy. The thought of returning after so long made her stomach flutter with unease. On the morning of her departure, she looked once more at the check from the solicitor. She hadn't deposited it yet. She wasn't ready to. The sum sat there, a figure that would turn heads at any bank in England. But to her, it wasn't real. Not compared to the ache in her chest, the loneliness that clung to the walls of the cottage long after twilight had passed. She stepped out into the chill air, her wool coat buttoned high, and locked the door behind her. At the station, she watched families board with wrapped gifts and noisy children. She was the only one traveling alone. The train glided through the countryside, past frozen fields and quiet villages. She held her handbag close and stared out of the window, her reflection soft and ghostly in the glass. She imagined their faces when she arrived. Would they greet her at the door? Would Edward hug her? Would there be questions, apologies? Or would they look through her, as if she were merely the carrier of something far more valuable? Margaret's train pulled into Guildford Station as the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the platform. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, scents she associated with Christmases long past. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing the years of silence between her and Edward. A black car awaited, polished and gleaming. A woman stepped out, her smile polite but unreadable. "Mrs. Holloway. Welcome to Surrey. I'm Lydia. Edward sends his regards." Margaret nodded, clutching her small handbag tighter. Lydia's presence was graceful, her manner poised, the very picture of a woman who belonged to a world Margaret had only glimpsed from afar. They drove through winding country lanes to Rosebourne Hall, an imposing estate surrounded by towering oaks and manicured gardens. The grand doors opened, revealing a hall adorned with festive wreaths and crackling fires. Inside, Edward stood by the fireplace. He looked older, his hair touched by grey, but his eyes held the same spark Margaret remembered, a spark that had once been both a source of pride and pain. For a moment, they simply stared. No words, just a shared history suspended in the room like dust motes in the firelight. Then Edward spoke, his voice low but steady. "Mum. I'm glad you came." Margaret felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, hope, all tangled and raw. That night, as the house filled with laughter and music, Margaret wondered if this Christmas would finally begin to heal the wounds of the past. The morning after her arrival, Margaret awoke to the muffled sounds of laughter and footsteps echoing through the vast corridors of Rosebourne Hall. It was the kind of sound she hadn't heard in a very long time, and yet it filled the grand estate with a warmth she had long forgotten. Dressing quietly, she moved towards the large bay window overlooking the garden, where frost glittered on the trimmed hedges and delicate branches of the oak trees. The silence outside contrasted sharply with the life inside the house. Margaret's mind drifted back to the years of separation, the years that had felt like an eternity. When Edward was just a boy, she had been his whole world. She remembered how he used to run to her every evening after school, his school bag swinging wildly, his eyes shining with excitement or frustration. Those days had felt simple then. But the world outside their little home in Cornwall had other plans. Edward's father had left when Edward was 5. The pain of abandonment was still fresh in Margaret's heart, not just for herself, but for her son, who had grown up with an absence that neither time nor love could fully heal. She recalled the fights, the shouting matches that ended with slammed doors and silent tears. Edward, growing angrier, distancing himself, finding his refuge in anything but home. The years of silence between them were not empty, they were filled with words unsaid and feelings buried deep beneath the surface. As she stood by the window, Margaret remembered the day she received the letter from Edward's solicitor. The fortune, inherited from Edward's late grandmother, was more than she had ever dreamed of. But with that money came memories, responsibilities, and questions she had no answer to. How could she bridge the gap that decades had carved between them? Could money ever mend a broken relationship? Or was this just another illusion, a trap dressed in gold and promises? The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Lydia appeared, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "Good morning, Margaret," Lydia said softly. "Edward is waiting for you downstairs. Breakfast is ready." Margaret nodded, accepting the tray. The polite but distant smile Lydia wore felt like a mask. There was something in her eyes, a guardedness that spoke of secrets and silent battles. Walking down the wide staircase, Margaret entered the dining room, where Edward sat alone at the large oak table. His expression was unreadable as he looked up, but when their eyes met, a flicker of something warm passed between them. "Good morning, Mum," Edward said, his voice calmer than she remembered. "Good morning, Edward," she replied, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside. The breakfast passed in an awkward silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery and the distant crackling of the fire. Later that day, Edward took Margaret on a tour of the estate. As they walked through the halls lined with portraits of ancestors and shelves heavy with books, Margaret felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This was a world so different from the modest cottage she had left behind. "Do you remember your old school in Cornwall?" Edward asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Margaret smiled faintly. "How could I forget? You were always so clever, even when you were stubborn." Edward chuckled. "I think you're the only one who could keep me in line." For a moment, the past seemed to soften, replaced by memories that were both bitter and sweet. But as the afternoon sun dipped low, shadows lengthened, not just in the gardens but in their hearts. That evening, as the family gathered for Christmas dinner, the silence returned. The carefully set table was a fragile barrier between them, decorated with candles and holly, but underneath lay unresolved pain. Edward's wife, Lydia, sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She offered Margaret a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The conversation was polite but cautious, each word chosen carefully. Margaret caught herself glancing at Edward often, searching for a sign, any sign, that the years of silence could truly be erased. When the time came for gifts, Edward handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver locket. "For you," he said quietly. "To remember that you're always part of this family." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. It was a gesture she had longed for, yet feared. That night, as she lay in the guest room, the locket resting against her chest, Margaret wondered if this fragile piece could survive the coming days, or if the shadows of the past would return to claim them all. The morning of Christmas Day broke with a gentle frost and a pale winter sun. The old oak trees outside Rosebourne Hall were frosted with delicate icicles, sparkling in the early light. Margaret awoke to the quiet hum of the house settling, the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree lingering in the air. She dressed slowly, her mind restless with thoughts of the evening to come. The dinner. The family gathering. The fragile thread that now connected her to Edward, a thread that could snap at any moment. Downstairs, the house was already alive with activity. Lydia was in the kitchen, overseeing the preparations with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience. Edward was pacing near the fireplace, his face clouded with worry. Margaret entered the room quietly. "Good morning, Edward," she said softly. He turned to face her, his eyes searching. "Morning, Mum." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. "Are you ready for tonight?" she asked. Edward nodded. "I suppose I have to be." The tension between them was palpable. This was not just a Christmas dinner, it was a crossroads, a moment that could redefine their future. As the day wore on, guests began to arrive. Edward's cousins, aunts, and uncles filled the rooms with laughter and chatter. Margaret watched from a distance, feeling both an outsider and a part of this new world she had stepped into. Then came the moment that changed everything. After dinner, Edward took Margaret aside into the study, a warm room lined with books and family photographs. He closed the door gently behind them. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. Margaret's heart quickened. Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is from my grandmother," he said, handing it to her. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in the delicate handwriting she recognized from the photographs, her mother-in-law, Edward's grandmother. The letter spoke of secrets kept for decades, secrets about family debts, hidden wills, and the truth behind the fortune Margaret had inherited. It revealed that the money was not a blessing, but a burden, tied to conditions and obligations that could trap her in a web of legal battles and family disputes. Margaret's mind reeled. The fortune that had seemed like a gift was actually a chain, one that could bind her to a past she had tried to forget. Edward watched her closely, waiting for her reaction. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret whispered. "I wanted to protect you," Edward said. "But you deserve to know." The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret realized that this Christmas was not just a reunion. It was a reckoning. The shadows of the past were no longer distant memories. They were here, in the room with them, demanding to be faced. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope that the truth, no matter how painful, could bring healing. Fear that the family she longed to reconnect with might still be beyond her reach. She looked at Edward, at the man her son had become, and wondered what the future held for them both. The days that followed Christmas felt like walking through a thick fog. Margaret found herself trapped between the warm memories of the holiday and the cold realities the letter had revealed. Edward had invited her to stay at Rosebourne Hall, but the house, with all its grandeur and silent corridors, felt more like a prison than a home. She spent long hours in the study, reading through the documents her son had given her. Legal papers, contracts, and handwritten notes from decades ago. The deeper she delved, the more she understood the complexities that bound the fortune, and the family itself. One evening, as a chill wind rattled the windows, Lydia joined her in the study. "I know it's hard to take in," Lydia said softly, pouring 2 cups of tea. Margaret nodded, accepting the warmth of the cup in her hands. "There's more to this family than just money," Lydia continued. "Secrets, old grudges, mistakes no one talks about." Margaret looked at Lydia, sensing both kindness and caution in her words. "Is there a way out of this?" Margaret asked quietly. Lydia sighed. "Not without facing the past head-on. You can't change what happened, but you can decide what comes next." Margaret felt a mixture of fear and determination rise within her. The following days brought visitors, lawyers, distant relatives, even old family friends. Each conversation peeled back another layer of mystery. One afternoon, Edward took her to the village cemetery where generations of the Whitmore family were buried. Standing before a weathered tombstone, he told her stories of ancestors who had fought, loved, and lost. Margaret began to see that this inheritance was not just about money, it was about history, identity, and forgiveness. As the new year approached, Margaret knew that the real journey was just beginning. The arrival of the new year brought a sharp clarity to Margaret's thoughts. The festive joy had faded, replaced by the weight of decisions she could no longer avoid. She met with the family solicitor, Mr. Harrison, in a small wood-paneled office at Rosebourne Hall. He laid out the legal obligations tied to the fortune, conditions that required her to stay within the family estate for a minimum of 5 years, and restrictions on selling any property or assets without approval. Margaret felt trapped, as though the wealth was a gilded cage. Later that day, she confronted Edward. "Why didn't you tell me the full truth from the beginning?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward's face was tight with frustration. "I was scared, Mum. Scared of what you might do, scared of losing you again." Margaret's heart softened, but the bitterness lingered. In the days that followed, whispers of family discontent grew louder. Distant relatives began to appear, some with friendly smiles, others with hidden agendas. One afternoon, Margaret discovered a hidden drawer in an old desk in the study. Inside, a collection of letters bound with a faded ribbon. They were written by her late husband, James, revealing his struggles and regrets about the family's past decisions. As she read, Margaret felt tears blur the words. The man she had loved had been caught in a web of lies and sacrifices, much like herself. That night, Edward and Margaret talked long into the early hours. For the first time in years, they shared their fears and hopes openly. The path ahead was uncertain, but at least now they would walk it together. The weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations and unexpected reconciliations. Margaret and Edward worked side by side to navigate the complex legacy left behind. One crisp morning in early spring, Margaret stood in the garden of Rosebourne Hall, the soft sunlight filtering through budding branches. She breathed in the fresh air, feeling a quiet sense of peace she hadn't known for years. Edward approached her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thank you, Mum," he said quietly. "For staying. For trying." Margaret smiled gently. "Thank you for inviting me back. It means more than you know." Together, they began restoring not just the estate, but their fractured relationship. They reached out to relatives and old friends, seeking to mend fences and build bridges. Margaret understood that the fortune she had gained was not merely money or property. It was a chance to heal, to forgive, and to embrace the future with hope. As Christmas approached again, the halls of Rosebourne Hall were filled with laughter, music, and warmth, a far cry from the lonely years before. In the end, the greatest gift was the reunion of a mother and her son, rediscovering love after decades of silence.